Buongiorno a tutte e a tutti, a chi ci segue qui in sala, a chi è collegato in diretta o in differita sui canali social della Dom Spaziana, la pagina Facebook e il canale YouTube, e sulla pagina Facebook del Comitato Pisano per la storia del risorgimento dell'età delle rivoluzioni. Vi do il benvenuto a questo convegno, speriamo un po' leggermente più serio del titolo che abbiamo deciso di dargli. Come sapete è Giro, Giro mondo, anche per scherzare un po' con quello che in realtà è il nodo interpretativo forte da cui siamo partiti, cioè l'apparente paradosso per cui nel secolo che viene tradizionalmente raccontato come il secolo dell'affermazione dello Stato-nazione, dello spazio nazionale come modo anche di determinare i confini geografici del mondo, è anche il secolo in cui nasce o si consolida quella interconnessione globale che sarà poi alla base della prima globalizzazione fino ottocentesca e inizio novecentesca, e che ancora oggi per molti aspetti è tuttora operativa. Quel mettere insieme tutte le diverse parti del mondo attraverso tempi che, come vedremo, appunto sono a volte in coordinato, a volte con un decalage, ma sono comunque interconnessi tra di loro, è qualcosa che nasce nel corso o comunque si consolida a raggiungere la sua maturità nel corso del XIX secolo. Come Domus Mazziniana abbiamo appoggiato da subito il progetto che nasce all'interno di uno scambio di una discussione, uno scambio di idee che ha coinvolto i due dipartimenti dell'Università di Pisa, al cui interno appunto si svolge la ricerca storica, per il Dipartimento di Civiltà e Forme del Sapere, del cui direttore, il professor Simone Colladini, vi porto il saluto, purtroppo impegnato in altri convegni che si svolgono in contemporanea, e il Dipartimento di Scienze Politiche, e anche in questo caso porto il saluto del professor Calabrò, che appunto stamattina ci ha avvertito di non poter essere presente, così come del nostro direttore, del nostro presidente, il professor Mancarella, e del direttore dell'Istituto di Storia per la storia del risorgimento italiano, il professor Alessandro Cappi, che ha voluto offrire un contributo non solo con il proprio patrocinio, ma con il sostegno economico, così come l'Ateneo, l'Università di Pisa. Questo convegno rientra all'interno dell'attività scientifica cofinanziata appunto dall'università. Il luogo che abbiamo scelto è la Domus Mazziniana, che in qualche modo è emblematica di questa correlazione tra costruzione dello Stato nazionale, chi più di Giuseppe Mazzini, ma insieme una casa che apparteneva ad una famiglia in cui un pezzo era a Livorno, un pezzo a Pisa, un pezzo in Gran Bretagna, e che corrispondevano tranquillamente tra di loro, passando dall'italiano all'inglese, che poi decidono metà della famiglia di diventare cittadini italiani e metà cittadini inglesi, continuando a restare membri della stessa famiglia, delle stesse relazioni personali di affari e di affetti. Ci sembrava estremamente simbolico di questa sovrapposizione tra elementi che a prima vista potrebbero sembrare invece tra loro divergenti. Quindi grazie ancora a tutte e a tutti per essere qui presenti, grazie ai tanti che hanno partecipato all'elaborazione scientifica, ma di questo e più ampiamente delle ragioni del convegno lascio la parola a Marco Manfredi, appunto, per presentarvi meglio tutto il progetto. Grazie ancora.
Sì, grazie. Io farò anche una breve introduzione, anche perché parte delle cose che volevo dire sulla genesi e le ragioni di questo convegno sono state anticipate già da Pietro Finelli. Soltanto ricordo appunto che per noi questo convegno è comunque un evento importante. Io presiedo il Comitato del Risorgimento e dell'Età delle Rivoluzioni di Pisa, perché è il primo convegno che riusciamo appunto a realizzare come comitato, essendo appunto rinato a nuova vita il comitato da un paio di anni. sulla scia anche del processo un po' di rilancio dell'Istituto Nazionale del Risorgimento, a cui i comitati sono affiliati, dopo anni di lungo commissariamento. Quindi noi rientriamo, diciamo così, in questa nuova fase di rilancio. Anche il finanziamento che l'Istituto ci ha dato per questo convegno speriamo che faccia parte di questo progetto di rilancio. Il nostro comitato, come dice anche il suo nome, che ha voluto essere non solo del Risorgimento ma dell'età delle rivoluzioni, guarda, diciamo così, al studio del Risorgimento, ma più in generale dell'Ottocento, con un approccio, diciamo, non celebrativo, ma che vuole essere un approccio scientifico, di ricerca, critico, problematico agli studi sull'Ottocento e sui movimenti nazionalpatriottici ottocenteschi. Abbiamo cercato come comitato anche di rinnovare, di coinvolgere giovani studiosi, dottorandi, laureandi, che si sono formati in una stagione storiografica, ma questo in un certo senso vale anche per me, insomma, che sono un po' più anziano, per la generazione di studiosi come me che si sono formati nell'ultimo trentennio in un contesto di studi sull'Ottocento segnato fortemente, diciamo così, dalla svolta culturalista che ha messo anche in dubbio cioè, o ha riproblematizzato il concetto di nazione, ecco, come invenzione della politica moderna rispetto a visioni che appunto vedono la nazione come una società naturale di carattere eterno, che in parte visioni che sono ancora presenti, insomma, nel dibattito pubblico. E allo stesso tempo un trentennio di studi che ha fortemente messo in crisi, ecco, il paradigma nazionale. Pensiamo al successo della World History, della Global History e anche appunto all'approccio transnazionale, agli studi anche sui movimenti nazionalpatriottici che hanno valorizzato questa chiave interpretativa. Ora, stando lì soltanto all'Italia, penso agli studi per esempio di Maurizio Isabella che hanno inquadrato il risorgimento anche italiano in una più ampia chiave transnazionale. Quindi ecco, siccome lo spirito col quale guidiamo e abbiamo promosso questo comitato è questo, il nostro primo convegno ha cercato di restare dentro questa dimensione, ecco, dell'Ottocento, ma anche dei risorgimenti nazionali in questa ampia chiave più transnazionale, no? Anche se, come ricordava Pietro, l'Ottocento è il secolo d'oro dei risorgimenti, della formazione delle identità nazionali, del loro consolidamento, però è anche un secolo, non dobbiamo dimenticarlo, e lo spirito un po' di questo convegno, anche segnato da forti tendenze sistemiche, ma anche da impulsi politici, come dire, di forte segno solidaristico, da forti pulsioni anche e progetti politici di carattere internazionalista, oltre che spesso si intrecciano con quelli di carattere nazionalista. Dicevamo prima appunto, e lo ricordava anche Pietro in un certo senso, ricordando la storia di questa casa e di Mazzini che in questa casa è morto, i movimenti nazionalpatriottici sono poi fortemente innestati ed intrecciati con istanze di carattere cosmopolita e transnazionale. Quindi volevamo restituire, speriamo di riuscirci un po', questa complessità dell'Ottocento anche come secolo appunto fortemente segnato da questo genere di tensioni che convivono con le spinte nazionali. Con la politica che si nazionalizza, ma con la politica anche che risente di questo processo, come ha detto prima Pietro, di prima globalizzazione che l'Ottocento conosce, una politica che tende se stessa a globalizzarsi e a trascendere le identità e i confini nazionali. Ora, queste relazioni che ospitiamo oggi sono molto varie, appunto affrontano alcuni aspetti di questa transnazionalità, ce ne potevano essere altre, anche perché, e questo lo dico appunto con una certa soddisfazione, avevamo ricevuto più di 40 proposte e per ragioni, diciamo così, di tempo, di spazi, di budget, abbiamo dovuto sacrificare diverse proposte, abbiamo fatto una scelta e la scelta ha portato a questo programma. ha un programma appunto estremamente variegato, forse anche troppo variegato, però in un certo senso nella sua varietà ci restituisce questa idea di un Ottocento, diciamo così, dalle tante tonalità, dai tanti colori, dai tanti aspetti, che è quello che volevamo un po' valorizzare. Così come anche la scelta di cui abbiamo discusso se imporre, diciamo, una lingua o al massimo due. Poi abbiamo scelto di far parlare in inglese, in italiano, in francese, e anche poi non credo siano arrivati poi alla fine, o abbiamo selezionato interventi in spagnolo che forse c'erano nelle proposte originarie, però l'idea era appunto di lasciare anche da questo punto di vista una pluralità anche di voci, di possibilità appunto di parlare in diverse lingue, visto che comunque più o meno riusciamo, diciamo, a comprendere queste lingue che fanno parte ormai della comunità accademica. Infine, prima delle relazioni abbiamo deciso di invitare appunto una studioso che introducesse con un intervento più lungo questo convegno. La scelta alla fine è caduta su Quentin Delouermoz, perché mi ha detto che si pronuncia anche la Z data l'origine savoiarda del cognome. E perché abbiamo scelto lui? Lo abbiamo scelto perché sicuramente con la sua pratica storiografica è fra gli studiosi che negli ultimi anni ha cercato di più di attenersi a questo approccio di un Ottocento visto in chiave non meramente nazionale. In particolare segnalo il suo ultimo monumentale lavoro, per certi versi estremamente importante, sulla Comune parigina, che è un lavoro che proprio letteralmente fa esplodere questa comune, trasformandola in un evento planetario, non legandolo rispetto a precedenti interpretazioni della storiografia francese soltanto alle rivoluzioni francesi dell'Ottocento, ma invece dimostrando con efficacia come la comune rappresenti un evento di portata globale e non un fatto meramente francese, di come altre esperienze consimili in quegli anni si realizzino in altri paesi, o anche dove non si realizzano si parla notevolmente di questa esperienza. Quindi il suo libro sulla Comune di Parigi è un esempio di questa pratica storiografica che intendevamo valorizzare con questo convegno, e per questo abbiamo deciso di invitarlo. Quindi fra poco gli darò la parola, solo alcune considerazioni pratiche perché non tutti forse ancora sanno i dettagli appunto organizzativi del convegno. Oltre a consentire a tutti di parlare nella propria lingua, o comunque in francese, in italiano e in inglese, abbiamo anche deciso di non mettere dei discussant per dare maggiore spazio alle domande alla fine di ogni panel, quindi ci sarà spazio per le domande e per un confronto appunto con i relatori. Abbiamo deciso, no Pietro, di fare una piccola pausa caffè alla fine della relazione di Quentin, e poi avremo offerto appunto dal convegno una aperitivo cena verso le 7, e domani invece avremo una piccolo light lunch all'ora di pranzo insieme, sempre qui presso il giardino qui fuori, il giardino della Domus, il piccolo giardino qui fuori della Domus Mazziniana. Va bene, poi non so se resterà il tempo perché Pietro possa fare una piccola visita di 5 minuti, farvi vedere almeno il piano superiore con appunto la collezione del patrimonio appunto di Mazzini, e a questo punto lascio la parola a Quentin Delouermoz, ricordando però che Quentin, di cui ho riportato il libro sulla comune, è uscito in francese nel 2022, mi sembra, 2022, che insegna all'università Paris-Cité, okay, che è un'università di fondazione abbastanza recente, 2019 mi sembra sia nata questa università. E Va bene, gli lascio la parola e lo ringrazio moltissimo per aver accettato il nostro invito.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very kind presentation. I don't understand English, but I understood it was very kind. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. As for the PowerPoint, maybe what we can do is that I change here and you follow, because otherwise it will cut my talk. Okay, it's perfect. So, history, I will speak in English. History of the 19th century, currently in a pivotal position. Firstly, because of the present situation on the one hand, the ideas, the European project has broken down, seems to have become a reality, see the recent elections, associated, among the other things, with a feeling of loss of power in relation to all the new powers, like the United States, China, India, and so on. Europe today is the old continent. Yet it remains an economic power and an important political and cultural reference point, whether perceived positively or negatively. This is a reminder that Europe was one of the major poles of world power for a century and a half, and that while this role may be fading today, many of its supposed characteristics, human rights, individual, democracy, capitalism, socialism, industrialization, and so on, left their mark on global history precisely in the 19th century and remains active even if transformed. We simply feel that a re-evaluation is necessary. That's my second point, historiographical. Europe of the 19th century developed and for a long time imposed a great narrative about itself and its advent and its exceptionalism. This narrative needs now to be discarded. Given the new knowledge available on other regions of the world, calls to provincialize Europe, or at least to put it back in its rightful place, are not frequent. Take, for example, this issue of the review Annales entitled L'histoire européenne après le tournant global, European history after the global turn, or the cluster Decentering Eurocentrism of the European Institute in Florence. What is needed then is a new understanding and interpretation in this history, both internally and externally, so by taking into account those interconnectedness in economic, cultural, social, political terms, as in anthropological ones. The famous opposition between them and us, it's no more available today. This revision has already begun in certain fields, such as in economic history. It is less the case for political history, which is the subject of this conference. So the situation is very roaring in political terms, but more stimulating in scientific ones. In this lecture, I would like to set out what is at stake in this situation, recall the characteristics of the transnational imperial and global approach, show some of the effects of this rereading, raise some questions that are now open, and above all, rejoice in this scientific event. So let's begin with my first point. It's okay for the change? Okay. The issues we are about to address are not new. On the contrary, they are well established and we need to know where we come from. The 19th century is often called the century of history because the discipline of history as we know it was being forged at that time. It was from the 18th century onward that its region presented as a coherent geographical space, even though its boundaries are always vague, began to distinguish itself from Christendom. You have here a quotation typical of this way of seeing the situation. Europe is the smallest part of the world, and so on and so on. This perception accompanied a fundamental movement in the culture of time, the affirmation of what the German historian Reinhard Koselleck called the modern regime of historicity. So the past is slipping away, the present is shrinking, and the future is opening up to vast space, driven by the idea of progress. This perception is based on a series of transformations taking place at that time, to which it gives a direction and a narrative. According to this narrative, Europe would be in the vanguard of this historical becoming. So what are those changes? And with this, three, it's okay. Between the end of the 18th century and 1830, Europe experienced what historian Patrick O'Brien describes as a great drop-off, grand décrochage. Broadly, over the period 1750 and 1950, the share of Asia, Africa, and Latin America in global industrial production declined by 70% to the benefit of the region we are dealing with and the American colonies that has become the United States. This phenomenon, as you know, went hand in hand with a profound transformation of societies, which saw the manufacturing sector becomes driving force behind economic organization, and with the emergence of new social groups such as bourgeoisie, worker, and so on. This change is also reflected in urban development. At the end of the 18th century, London was barely the size of Beijing in China. 1 century later, few cities could rival it with 2.5 million of inhabitants or Paris. Obviously, these changes do not affect everyone. They operate at different speeds and generate resistance, but they are here. And the political sphere, of course, is not here. The main sign of change is probably the affirmation of a new phenomenon called the revolution. The change in meanings say it all about this new relationship with time. Originally, revolution means an astronomical cycle, the cycle of the planet. At the end of the 18th century, it referred to the desire to overthrow a regime and to radically change social, political, and cultural relationship. So, it is true that the 19th century was also the century of revolution, with the French Revolution as its center, so much that it has long been considered as a date of entry into contemporary history. It was followed by a movement in 1830, 1848, 1870, until the Russian Revolution of 1917 altered this supposed trajectory. Revolution give rise to other notions: citizen, popular and national sovereignty, equality. It also functions as a pair of opposites with reaction, revolutionary reaction, reform, and all the associated vocabulary in thinking: liberalism, conservatism, socialism, and so on. For the sociologist George Lawson, that you may have on the slide, the revolutionary phenomenon of the late 18th century is at the origin of what he called modern political grammar all around the world. The other major category of action and sought to emerge and assert itself is the nation. Here again, its history is relatively well established. Also, the term existed earlier. The national idea was forged in the 18th century by European literacy. The idea was to go beyond classical French culture by tracking down the soul of people. The national idea then came to the fore with the French Revolution, and according to a famous diagram taken up by Eric Hobsbawm, it was carried by the urban bourgeoisie and land association, what you call phase B, and spreading to wider section of the population and attracting the interest of the state in the end of the 19th century, the famous phase C. At the end of the century, the processes of nationalization and etatization gathered pace, sometimes culminating in the creation of nation-states such as Italy and Germany. We know now that continental empire adapted very well to the new situation. Similarly, it should be remembered that national identities were then anchored by a state policy, whether it be through the establishment of infrastructure or by symbols and an official memory. This work also proceeds in opposition to others, other European nations, other populations of the world perceived as less advanced. And it is true that the affirmation of national identities was also fueled by the parallel development of the new imperialism, you have the map here, of the 1880s, which intensified the colonial enterprise, particularly in Africa. So that's the point of departure. So much for this too quickly painted picture and this well-known story. It must be stressed that this history has given rise to a great deal of rich and varied historians' work, which has considerably increased our understanding of it. But seen from a certain distance, and apart from some exception, some frameworks have changed little for a long time. This is the case of that of the nation states, or of the principle of comparison between large regions, including Europe, or with an implicit or explicit schema of modernization. And all this we need now to find other way of thinking, which help me to go to my second point. Is it okay for the talk, you can follow with a program. Don't hesitate to tell me. I try to keep my time, but if you need, I can gain some minutes. So shifting the gaze, let's see those famous transnational, imperial, and global approaches. This way of understanding history were challenged at the end of the 1980s with the questioning of precedent paradigm, for instance, the structure, and of the great narratives. They gave way to new ways of doing history. To put it briefly, microhistory, return of the event, return of the narrative, attention to the reflective actors with the important role of gender story, or the interplay of scales. And at the same time, not always in the same group or institution, approaches have emerged that emphasize connection, precisely in order to oppose what they call methodological nationalism, or to oppose to the idea of Europe opposed to the rest of the world. These different currents have sometimes opposed each other, but basically they all share the same focus on contingency, interrelationship, and the way in which actors see and perceive the world. That's why I propose interconnected and comprehensive history. This later approach of spatial opening were driven by phenomena that were contemporary with them. On the one hand was what was then called globalization, which was not new, but which was accelerating rapidly at the time. Think of the effect of the beginning of internet from the 1990s. And on the other hand, the collapse of the Soviet regimes and the struggle for decolonization and independence. In the latter case, formerly colonized populations were claiming their own history and historicity and challenging the Western-centric narrative. Various historiographies have been formalized within this framework. Their emergence is by no means straightforward, but I propose to summarize and clarify in retrospect. Let's start with one of the first to emerge, the transnational approach. It's the Green Book. It was originally linked to a desire on the part of certain historians to move away from American exceptionalism. Transnational history is against national exceptionalism. So one of the reference texts is Thomas Bender, A Nation Among Nations. You have the cover here. But other versions were quickly set up in Spain or in Germany. It's not only an American affair. In any case, this history refers to the study of the circulation of people, objects, and ideas, the configurations they form, the polarities that drive them, all according to fields of force that transcend borders. That's transnational history. Now, Imperial History is the second book. It's a little different, since it's opposed to an old imperial history. This old imperial history praised the affirmation of European empire, or denounced it, but in each case, it neglected the agency of the population concerned. So the new imperial history, on the contrary, is interested in the colonial enterprise, in territories under informal domination, and colonial societies, as well as the effects on the metropolis, the feedback. We might mention here works by Catherine Hall or Frederick Cooper. Finally, let's come to global history, which was asserting itself at the same time. We can take up Sebastian Conrad analysis here. This is the third book. Global history does not intend to make the history of the world as a whole, but to study long-range interdependencies on several continents. And the challenge here is to get away from a Eurocentric reading by recalling the diversity of poles of change on a planetary scale. The aim, too, is to emphasize the large-scale integration processes generated by these interdependencies and to raise once again the question of causality if it's in history, which was get away in the previous decade. For the 19th century, the most famous example is Christopher Bailey, Birth of the Modern World, but I suppose you know that. As we can see, these histories involve different types of approach, which can sometimes be opposed, sometimes be complementary. See connected history, comparative history, multi-situated approach, global microhistory, and so on and so on. They have already produced some very important results, and I will propose you two examples before going further in the subject of discussion. This is the third one, industrialization, French Revolution. Let's begin by industrialization. As Giorgio Riello has recently shown in a paper, Past and Present, the rise of the cotton industry in the 18th and 19th century must be seen in the context of an earlier transformation in consumption that affected several regions of the world, Europe, the Atlantic, and India. So he says this region were already interconnected. Europe was not alone. You don't have Europe, then interconnection. They were already there. The changes in this industry over the course of the century thus had an impact of each of the area concerned, each with its own dynamic. And as other studies of the global history of industrialization have shown, you have here Alessandro Stanzene's book, the main interconnected shift took place at the end of the 19th century. So this is one of the problems with the great regional comparison, such as the one I proposed earlier with the 70%. It overlooks this interaction and temporality. As you can see, having this new picture in mind require a completely different reading for 1750, 1880, both for the history of Europe. Industrialization was not so important before the end of the 19th century, and for that of the other region involved, Atlantic, India, and so on. This is a shift. Second one, more important, it's the French Revolution, which has been the focus of a very intense international attention. Numerous studies have linked its causes to wider phenomena such as the Industrial Revolution, the consequences of the 7 Years' War at the end of the 18th century, and so on. Not without debate. I have proposed you here the paper by David Bale, questioning the global turn. And David Bale reminded us that this insertion took nothing away from the dynamic of the French Revolution itself. The storming of the Bastille, the abolition of privilege on 4th of August, all that is very important. This is a significant reminder for this analysis. The macro scales of analysis must not overwhelm the other, nor replace them. On the contrary, articulating them help to understand each other better. So how does it look like for the French Revolution? The history of the French Revolution, with its key date and moment, remain essential. I have just told you that. But this new view invites a number of shifts. We are now considering together the American Revolution, the Batav Dutch Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and the French Revolution. And they are linked, for instance, the famous decree abolishing slavery in 1794 in France was a direct product of the struggles for emancipation from slavery in Saint-Domingue, the French colony, between 1791 and 1793. The real universalism of the French Revolution comes from its colony. It's a good example of this imperial history. This attention also invites us to consider the extension of the revolutionary debates and concepts through the Europe, whether by imitation or by the effect of conquest, think to the Italian sister republic. Finally, from a global perspective, the Latin American independence revolution that followed the overthrow of the Spanish Empire in 1808 in Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and so on, need to be taken into account. Other works, and all is in these new slides, here it's a wave of the south. Other works show the resonance of the French Revolution reaching as far as the Indian Ocean, notably with the action of the Sultan Tipu of Mysore. And still the third one, reminds us that Europe and America were not the only one at stake. In West Africa was also shaken by a very important movement of social and political transformation marked by jihad, as witnessed by the creation of the Sokoto Caliphate in 1877, which was one of the strongest empires in Africa at that time. Their ideas were different from the emancipation project proposed in the north, but this phenomenon is evidence of the existence of several centers of political and cultural transformation during the same period. What's more, this movement had a direct effect on the flow of slaves in the Atlantic slave trade, which continues even if the French Revolution, the other revolution occurred. Within this broader framework, as you see, the French Revolution is not diluted, but its interpretation can be refined. We can discuss the definition of a revolution. We can question its exceptionalism or universalism. we can observe the continuity of the Atlantic slave trade, and so on and so on. It changed the way of analyzing this phenomenon. 2 points should be noted before coming to these 2 days that bring us together. Firstly, while the French Revolution had been studied extensively, less attention has been paid to the rest of the 19th century, whether in Europe or not. This is changing, but there is a lot of work to do. Secondly, these connected histories, and especially study of circulation and global history, has been criticized in recent years. One of the arguments was to say that the initial enthusiasm for globalization in the 2000s has gradually faded as ecological destruction, rising economic inequalities, and the return of hardline nationalism has been confirmed. One of the leading figures of global history tells this in 217, Jeremy Edelman, and I have give you the quotation on the PowerPoint. History has changed, he says, a powerful political movement has emerged against globalism. In short, we need narratives of global lives that reckon with disintegration as well as integration, and so on and so on. In recent years, historians heard the call and have undertaken a number of changes. They began to study asymmetries and power relationship in opposition to the too fluid circulation and above-ground approach. New population have been included in the surveys: sailors, slaves, machinery, workers, soldiers, women, and so on. The themes have broadened to include war and conflict, things that don't circulate in marginal or marginalized space. Subjects that were initially set aside have once again become worth of attention, such as nationalism or state. The latter, for example, is also proving to be a player among others in these flows, as well as in the rules, value, barrier, and power relations that are trying to organize the global space. This is a new landscape we are dealing with, and it seems to me that this is a context in which this conference is being held, and that's why I think it's a very important conference, and I'm very glad to be there. So let's give some more concrete example with my third point. It's okay, you follow without problem? Okay, no. So to launch this movement, I would now like to present 2 concrete examples of this interconnected and comprehensive shift in history. They are centered on France in the 19th century, and I will distinguish 2 aspects: nation state and revolution. 2 different aspects. Let's begin with France as a nation state. The exceptionalist narrative is very present in the history of France. If you listen to some survey, you will read this. France is supposed to be the country of the long history of the state, of the high culture, of the French Revolution, a beacon of the Republic after 1880, and to have its own industrial path compared to Great Britain. So the history of France is an excellent candidate for transnational history. I'll pass quickly over the transnational dimension of national identity history, which is well known thanks to the work of Anne-Marie Thiès. This is the first book. She shows the circulation of the same national identity kit, history, language, flame, anthem, national days, and so on, between different countries, but it is well known. So I will take another example, the imperial dimension of France. Historical work generally present France, then its empire. It's not only the case for France, to be honest. In fact, France has been an imperial state since the 17th century. David Todd's second book has recently shown that it was at the origin of an original velvet imperialism, different from the English one, based on cultural distinction and the economy of luxury and semi-luxury. This velvet imperialism was reorganized with the acceleration of the colonial enterprise in 1870. So, in other words, the French nation state was being built at the same time as the empire was being reconfigured. At the beginning of the 20th century, the ratio between the surface area of the metropolis and the empire is 1 to 20. So it's impossible to think of them separately, and we must speak of an imperial nation state. And if you consider this, it has direct consequences for political history. Just take an example. The principle of equal rights guaranteed by the Republican regime at the end of the century does not fit. first of all, the major issue of women was forgotten. But even when the colonial context is taken into account, we are dealing instead with a form of legal pluralism, which is characteristic of empire, in which statuses that are usually thought to be linked, as nationality and citizenship, are often dissociated and are object of debates. I have give you a quotation of Emmanuel Sada, which expresses the consequences very well. The empire, for France, appears to be the place where a republic is projected, where it deploys all the tension and contradictions that make it, beyond the dogmatic affirmation of principles, a profoundly contingent object, in that it is a permanently open project. And this does not prevent France from appearing in Latin America or in the Ottoman Empire to the Young Turk at the beginning of the 20th century as a model of republic, social for one, constitutional for the other, always according to a specific situation. So you see here a richer, more complex polycentric history of France and of politics is taking shape. That's the first example. So let's see now the Paris Commune that Marco evoked earlier. The other example is more specific, this time borrowed from the history of revolution. The Paris Commune from March to May 1871. I can go into the detail of the event. Maybe you know the most famous figures such as Gustave Courbet or Louis Michel. Let's just say that the book on the Commune I will use here, which is mine, combine a from below perspective with a transnational impaired and global study. In my mind, both are necessary, but here I will emphasize the latter, touching on elements that will be discussed over the course of these 2 days. It's interesting because often we heard that the Commune was an isolated event, an apex. It's not so sure. What does this transnational dimension look like? Firstly, the Commune was part of the socialist and republican struggle of 1848-1870 through transnational volunteers. The movement took place in the context of a war, the Franco-Prussian War, and the proclamation of the French Republic. Thousands of international volunteers, Italian, Poles, Belgian, Greek, American, Uruguayan, and so on, came to the aid of the Universal Republic under the command of General Giuseppe Garibaldi, that you know, but I presume you is here. Many of them has been involved in the post-1848 struggles, Italian unity, Polish uprising of 63, the glorious Spanish Revolution, the American Civil War, and so on. And some later joined the Paris Commune as Lucien combats. These international fighters were not so numerous compared to the mass in Parisian National Guard, but they gave substance, in addition to the appeal of the Commune itself, to the idea of an international dimension of what they call the Republic of Paris. This connection to the Republican and social struggle of the time was also facilitated by the existence of new international organizations in the 1860s. This is another important aspect of the discussion to come, if I have correctly seen the program. It is the case for the International Working Men's Association, founded in London in 1864 and led, among others, by Karl Marx. And this association was flourishing at the end of the 1860s. Although the Central Committee's support at the beginning was timid, it was clear and more precocious among the national sections. Demonstrations of support to the Commune were organized in April in London and Geneva, but support also came from other groups more or less linked to this section, such as the Democratic Society of Florence. In New York, I have given the example, I think in New York, the English-speaking section of the International Working Men Association brought together the Paris Commune and lockdown miners from Pennsylvania in the same sympathy meeting. From March onward, the Commune also became a banner for many causes: liberal, 48 Republican, federalist, socialist, workers, and so on. And paradoxically, this attention also brought out its profound originality in the eyes of those involved. Even that's the second connection. Third one, even if there was no European or extra-European wave, we must add to the analysis a movement of communes, both national and imperial. Before Paris, there were also communes in Lyon, in Marseille, And in Algiers, this one is as well known. There was a commune in Algeria. The movement lasted, nevertheless, several months, marked by republican ideals and the French Revolution of 1793. It took its cue from the Paris experience to the point of identifying with it. So the link between the Paris Commune and Algiers Commune is direct, is said, is official. Interestingly, it was also a movement of colonists turned against the indigenous Arab. And here we see the possible diversity of the republican universalism of that time. In this sense, the Algiers Commune helped trigger the Kabyle uprising, the largest anti-colonial revolt of the century in Algeria, which gained momentum from April onward. And here we see another important thing, a link between European and non-European dynamics, the latter being parallel, but very powerful in other areas, which here intersect. And it had an impact on the revolt in Paris, since it explained another reason why the other power had an interest in its end. This tremor undermined the imperial order, which was made of concurrence, but also cooperation. My fourth point, the main phenomenon was elsewhere. The Paris Commune in March 1871 was undoubtedly one of the most mediatized, publicized events of that period. There was a reason for this. A new revolution and civil war was taking place in Paris, capital of modernity and revolution, after the Franco-Russian conflict. Added to this were the profound technical and media transformation of the 1860s. And here we see the importance of infrastructure, another important issue for us. In 1866, the Atlantic cable made it possible for news to travel from one continent to another in a matter of hours rather than days. In the 1850s, major press agencies were set up, Reuters, Wolf, Alvas, to circulate the news. So here you have this interconnected 19th century. The Commune was covered not only by European newspapers, but also the British sphere of influence and across the Atlantic in Brazil, Mexico, United States, and so on. But each reception corresponds to a different appropriation. In the United States, for example, readings were adjusted according to the context of post-Civil War reconstruction. In Mexico, Republican and liberal commentators distinguish between European modernity, I use here James Sanders' paper, between European modernity, which was supposed to be based on state and capitalism, not good, and American modernity, based on federal republic, equality and fraternity, good. So for them, the Commune was a very good idea, but better suited for Latin American soil. And as you see, many other communes were formed in the same time. What are the feedback effects on Paris? They are partial. The communards were marked by this transnational global dimension, while at the same time being caught up in the dynamic of the struggle. And this appropriation and rereading were marked by the episode of the Paris Commune, of course. But they also have, as we see, their own autonomy. After the end of the Paris Commune's terrible end, 10,000 dead, known as Bloody Week, the media reception changed. The first readings were very negative, but I will emphasize here the appropriation. The Commune became both the embodiment of the martyrdom of social struggle and a place of revolutionary memory, with a very important affective dimension. Some of these are well known. Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin are two examples. Two different readings emerge. Together, they build up an analysis of the Commune as an high point in the past struggle history, a theme that was not present as such in the event. Another idea that gradually took root in the 1900s, in the beginning of the 20th century. But these are not the only reading and appropriation. References to the Commune were taken up again and again. For example, during the Spanish Cantonal Revolution of 1873, or, of course, in Italy, you know that. The reference then circulated on a larger scale, following the flow of Parisian exiles, but above all, local information and appropriation. In Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, newspaper called La Comuna were created in the 1860s. And the relationship with the Parisian adventure was explicit. I give you an example here. As long as there is a living man or woman, the commune will continue to exist because the great principles are immortal, and so on. It's pretty clear. In the United States, other appropriations were observed within the nascent radical culture of the 1870s and with a more feminist discourse. In this way, we can see an extension of the communal idea, each time enriched by local interpretation. So there was a multi-situated elaboration of that new historical notion that began to be called commune. This makes it easier to understand the COP of the Paris Commune as early as 1871. It was the result of a co-construction that was both local, because what happens at the local scale was very important, and global. This also explains why these local threats endure and interwin thereafter. And I use here Marco Manfredi's analysis, the commune contributed to spreading of what he calls the religion of socialism among the subaltern. This certainly played a role at the time of the Russian Revolution of 1917 and its aftermath, even if the latter partially modified its meaning. And you have here another history. So it's a part of global history. So much for these two examples. As you can see, this opening don't mean that everything that was said before is wrong, just that we need to look at it differently and to explore other fields of investigation. One last remark to understand this correctly. Just consider on a much larger scale. If you look at the same revolutionary phenomenon on a global scale and over a very long period of time, I make reference of the global history of revolution. Two conclusions can be drawn. First, the golden age of revolution was not the 19th century Europe, I'm sorry, but the period 1945, 1991 in Europe and most of all outside Europe linked to decolonization. And probably we are looking at the 19th century in the light of this period, a point that we must keep in mind. The second conclusion is that the break of the 18th century and this link to the new regime of historicity on the other hand is well confirmed. So it is here. But we understand that we can no longer associate this phenomenon with the only European continent. And this is here a huge question that is being raised. So another perspective, the 19th century is taking shape, which brings with it new questions and leave open a number of methodological difficulties with which I would like to conclude my fourth point. Latent issues. I will follow 5 questions to open the discussion to come. First question, Europe and the world. We are talking about an interconnected history, a less Europe-centric history, and Europe remains at the center. What should we do about this? If you're a historian of Europe and its empire and its connection is your topic, so it's normal that you work on it. But Jürgen Osterhammel, according to him, the 19th century poses a particular problem, very different from the 18th century. Europe, he says, whether real or fantasized, was such a reference at that time that it is difficult to do global history without it. It's this interview on the PowerPoint. This, to be honest, can be discussed. I'm not sure. But it is undoubtedly important to know, or at least to bear in mind, this new knowledge about Asia, Africa, Oceania, and their rich history with their own interconnectedness. Probably the time has come, first, to stop taking Europe as a sole center, and second, to move away from a global history that has long been backed without Europe. We need to consider Europe as a region, among others. Second question, the question of structure and comparison. As you have seen, connected and comparative studies have had an effect on the investigation of the 1990s, marked by the use of microhistory and the actors' level of analysis. The reevaluation of the underlying structures that made connection possible. So there is a new topic to observe. For example, the growth in trade, which has been increasing by 40% per decade since the 1820 in Europe, in Atlantic, in Mediterranean, and even in the Indian Ocean world. Imperial network, which largely explains the channels through which revolutionary ideas were disseminated and modified. Network of exiles, both progressive and conservative. The migration wave, very important in Europe, but also in the Asian region. And of course, we have seen telecommunication network, which explains the circulation of information, but also the fact that they do not reach at the same rate the different countries or even areas. Think about the difference between the countryside and the cities. In the same way, these approaches invite us to reactivate an essential tool that is often a source of mistrust among historians, comparison. But just look at the complete title of the book by Christopher Bailey, Global Connections and Comparison. This history invites us to cross-connection and comparison, but in a different way to before, more modest. It varies the units being compared, cities, regions, social group, and not just nation, and it incorporates the specific dynamic of the areas being compared. So we can talk about dynamic comparison. Extremely difficult to do, very important. Third problem, avoid diffusionism. Getting away from diffusionism is easier said than done. To do this, we also need to study the condition of reception and appropriation on the ground. And these are part of social spaces that are themselves hierarchical and caught up in multiple logic. With Emmanuel Furex and Clément Thibault, we speak of situated and connected history, and we tied this with the revolution of 1848, the second title. The most European of revolution had indeed a global impact. In each case studied in the book, Mexico, Haiti, Australia, California, the Balkans, the chapters show it is less the force of a model that spread from around the world than a tradition and local context that construct the intelligibility of European events. This is particularly true of the echoes of 1848 in several Latin American countries. From this perspective, the Spring of the People is not a model, but a polysemous reference embraced by multiple causes. And this observation invites us to view with a certain suspicion, certain common metaphor, such as waves, ripples, epidemic, and so on. They suggest a priori type of links that we need, in fact, to reconstruct. So we must be cautious against that. The language question. The fourth problem is mastery of language, and with it, mastery of the social and cultural world involved. This explains why this kind of research is often a collective one. This also applies when the world seems to be the same. I just give you an experience. Last year, a workshop on the notion of commune and community in the Republican political language between Europe and Latin America was organized in the 19th century. It was based on a real question. On both sides of the Atlantic, we find the same word with the same roots, the Latin comuna. So there is no real problem of translation, as when you translate revolution by the Chinese gaming, not exactly the same thing. But it takes on different and competing meanings in each area, communal community, and is enriched by the many local historical experiences, colonial situation, revolution, discrimination, and so on. So this means that when the Paris Commune, to take the present example, was received in Mexico, it was embedded in a very rich and ancient history that we must have in mind, and that changes the way it is understood from the outset. But what is exactly changed? It is very difficult to study this shift in meaning and their effect. How can we do? This is for you. Last problem, dilution and generalization, and I will keep my mind. 45 minutes.
Yes.
Okay. The final risk is that of the conclusion, which are sometimes disappointing. First case, the object you study, a revolution, an idea, political current, an emotion, lose consistency as this type of research progress. You have no conclusion, only plurality. Say, okay, what do we do with that? The problem arose in the case of 1848 when we wondered what was left of 1848, given that each resonance is a local reinterpretation taken from its own history. Aren't we talking about a collection of cases, so no interest? Second possibility is the contrary. There is a risk of neglecting this plurality in order to propose very too general conclusion. For instance, 1848 is a global moment of emancipation of the world. In general, you don't know anything. However, it is possible, based on the research carried out, to propose more modest conclusions. For instance, 1848 saw the spread of the language of democracy, particularly in the world of work and women's rights, even in British Empire. It was a time when abolitionism was accentuated in Latin America, even so the slave trade and slavery continued to exist. And finally, if 1848 saw the affirmation of the national question, which we all know that, it appears at this level that 1848 posed the question of colonization in a new light. Here too, the two issues, nation and colonization, went together. But you see, it's difficult to find the correct level of conclusion. So much for the vast program before us. I hope I have shown you that interconnection is not a given, and that this history is plural, demanding, and that it forces us to confront difficult questions of history. Now, it's up to you to take us there. The stakes are high because this history is probably one of the answers, among others, that researchers can provide to the mortifying debates of the moment. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Quentin, for this very rich paper and for the many suggestions you have offered to us, but facciamo una pausa. Yes. Quindi facciamo una piccola pausa a caffè. Per chi vuole, c'è il bar qui davanti, ma 5 minuti e poi ricominciamo. E anche le domande per questa relazione le rimandiamo in fondo dopo il primo panel. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you.